about all the time that has passed since urban civilization began more than 5,500 years ago, it sounds like an eternity. Historians who specialize in the United States investigate and write about people who lived maybe 100 or 200 years ago. Colleagues in medieval studies might analyze documents from 600 or 700 years ago. 5,500 years is on a different scale altogether. Fellow historians often view my field as impossibly distant in time. But you can look at it another way. I thought about this when my son was born. His birth coincided with the death of the comedian George Burns. It's amazing to my son that his life overlapped that of someone who was born in 1896, just 10 years after the German engineer Carl Benz patented the first gasoline-powered vehicle, and before the invention of the airplane, before houses had electricity or telephones, and before most of them had indoor bathrooms. Grover Cleveland was the president, and some veterans of the War of 1812 were still alive. And you can go back the same way to another centenarian. George Burns's life overlapped with that of a man named Colm de Baylis, who lived to the grand old age of 109. By the time he died, young George Burns was 10 years old. De Baylis was an Irish poet who was born in 1796, when George Washington was still president. So, the slightly overlapping lives of just 3 people take us back to the reign of Louis XIV. Add one more 100-year lifetime, and we're in 1596, with Shakespeare writing his early plays. And another just 5 lifetimes ago, and Columbus was returning to Spain after his second voyage to the New World. You can keep this up, going back one centenarian after another. Just 55 long lives, back to back, take us to the very beginning of cities. Even if you measure in the normal way, using parent-child generations, it's only about 200 of them from this moment now, right to the dawn of civilization. As a comparison, we're separated from the earliest humans by hundreds of thousands of generations. So, 200 generations since the start of civilization is not very long at all. We're babies at this business of civilization, if you look at it that way. We're living right at the beginning of history. Always supposing we humans managed not to destroy the planet or make our species extinct, we could survive as long as our pre-modern human ancestors did, millions of years. From that perspective, not only are we just getting started, but in relative terms, the Mesopotamians built their first cities pretty much yesterday. Think of all the things that we still have around us that started in ancient times. We live in rectangular houses made of natural materials like brick and wood, just as they did. Our houses are arranged on streets with front doors and with specialized rooms for socializing, sleeping, and bathing, just like theirs. We marry and have children and worry about disease, just like them. We obey laws, go to court if laws are broken. Our governments recruit armies who fight their enemies to the death in battle. We send diplomats to negotiate peace treaties. We worship gods, we bury our dead, we grow crops on farms, and we herd the same animals. We wear clothes made of animal products, wool and leather, and plant products, cotton and linen. To communicate, we use our hands to write with implements on natural materials, paper in our case, clay in the example of our predecessors. We tell stories and sing songs. In a great many ways, we still live like the Mesopotamians. This was even more true just 150 years ago, before modern medicine and electricity, cars, airplanes, computers, the internet, and so on. But even now, we are not that far removed from the kind of life that Mesopotamian people led, from about 3800 BCE to 3100 BCE, right when cities were getting started and writing was invented. We call this the Uruk period because Uruk was the world's first great city. If we could travel back in time, we'd recognize their lives, their cares, and their environment as not that different from ours. There's no way to know what the future holds, but I would bet that in a few thousand years, if they're still teaching courses about the history of the world, they'll include societies from ancient Mesopotamia to at least the 19th century in the category of ancient history and make generalizations that apply to all of us. All of this is to say that this lecture covers a crucial moment in human history, the early development of urban civilization. My students often assume that life in the first cities was much more chaotic and violent than now, but there's no evidence to suggest they're right. People seem to have adjusted to city living quite quickly and to have developed new norms of behavior. They also became more technologically innovative and more interested in the world beyond Mesopotamia. The place to start exploring this era is the city of Uruk, not far from Eridu in southern Mesopotamia. Scholars generally agree that by 3500 BCE, it was the biggest city in the world. It was surrounded by an immense brick wall that enclosed 260 hectares. That's about 642 acres, the size of a big university. That doesn't sound big for a city today, but it was huge for its time. Uruk had two major temple precincts, with a temple at the center of each, and surrounding courtyards and buildings. One was dedicated to the goddess Inanna, who was the goddess of love. The other was dedicated to Anu, the god of the heavens. The number of people called on to build these temples must have been enormous. One theory suggests that the temples took about 100 years to build and were immediately rebuilt as soon as they were finished to keep the population constantly employed. The temples would have been as impressive to visitors as medieval cathedrals were in their own time. One of the temple buildings was constructed of stone, which was rare in this area. Another had an eye-dazzling mosaic of colored geometrical patterns. These were made with clay cones impressed into mortar on huge interior columns and then polished. As many as 25,000 people lived in the city of Uruk at this time. But they weren't like modern city dwellers. The whole economy was based on farming, and most of the citizens would have owned or worked on farmland around the city. This was true throughout Mesopotamian history. Most Mesopotamian city dwellers walked out to the fields in the morning, spent their days farming, and returned to the city when it got dark. The efficiency of farming improved during the Uruk period with the invention of the plough. No longer did farmers have to dig holes in the ground and poke seeds into these openings in the earth. The blade on a plough, drawn by an ox or a donkey, could turn the soil over much more effectively, and the farmer could plant the seeds as he walked behind. Canals had also improved since the Ubaid period, which had lasted from about 6000 to 3800 BCE. Now the Mesopotamians could build canals big enough to sail boats in. The soil in the fields was naturally fertile. It was made up of silt that had washed down the river Euphrates over the eons. With effective irrigation and the plough, the fields became even more productive. Uruk peoples also improved bronze production and invented wheel-made pottery, wheeled transport, the cylinder seal, and a writing system. They also created an effective system of centralized government, though they still don't seem to have been ruled by kings. Let's look at each of these innovations in turn. Early bronzes weren't made with the classic mixture of copper and tin, for the most part, but instead with copper and arsenic. The arsenic made the bronze much stronger and more useful for tools and weapons than simple copper. Bronze tarnishes to a green patina if it's not polished, but it doesn't rust. And old bronze objects could always be melted down and reformed into something new. It was a wonderful new material. The people of the Uruk period figured out how to cast bronze in molds, so the metal could take just about any shape. It was used to make sculptures, bowls, cups, shields, daggers, razors, knives, mirrors, a vast array of things. The amount of copper imported from the Gulf and from Turkey must have increased enormously to meet the new demand. People didn't stop using stone tools. Those were still needed by many in society, but bronze became the material of choice for people who could afford it. Meanwhile, pottery seems to have lost some of its prestige. If you could eat from a bronze dish, why bother with a ceramic one? The pots made in the Uruk period became less interesting than those from the Ubaid period, perhaps because elite vessels were now made of metal. One kind of simple bowl has been found all over the place in the Uruk period. It's called a beveled rim bowl. These were made in molds and by the thousands. They're coarse and undecorated, almost as though they were made to be used and thrown away. Some scholars think they were used to measure and distribute rations to workers. Other kinds of pottery, jars, dishes, cups, and so on, began to be made in much larger quantities than before, but not in molds like the beveled rim bowls, or coiled by hand like the earlier Ubaid pots. Potters started to use the pottery wheel. A sort of mass production replaced the fine handmade ceramics industry of earlier times. It's possible that the invention of the pottery wheel preceded the actual wheel. Wheels seem so obvious that we tend to assume they were invented very early. Think of all those cartoons of a caveman standing next to a big stone wheel. But it's not an obvious development at all. Whole civilizations in other parts of the world managed to grow and thrive without ever inventing the wheel. To be of any use, a wheel needs to be perfectly round and sturdy and securely attached to an axle that won't break. In turn, the axle needs to be attached to a box or carriage and must be able to turn freely without getting jammed. And the whole contraption must be able to turn corners. The invention of the wagon was a marvel, even when the wheels were made of solid wood and the wagon rode on 4 heavy wheels. A wheeled cart could carry a great deal more cargo than a person could, and more cargo than could be put on the back of a donkey. Its closest parallel was a boat. But boats were no help if goods needed to be transported beyond the banks of a river or canal. Cylinder seals began to be used in the Uruk period to identify people who were responsible for the production of goods and their movement. In the Ubaid area that preceded the Uruk period, stamp seals were already being used further north. But once cylinder seals were invented, they became a fixture of Mesopotamian society for the next 3,000 years. They were ingenious. In today's society, we use signatures to attest to things. We sign credit card receipts, contracts, agreements, letters, and so on. A signature is a kind of commitment. In the Uruk period, writing was just beginning and people hadn't started using it to write names. So no one had a signature. Actually, that was true throughout Mesopotamian history. Even after writing was used extensively, people didn't sign their names. But you could buy a seal or be given one, and you could use this seal to identify things as yours, or to note that you had been somewhere and approved something. The seal provided evidence of your involvement, even when you were away. This is a remarkable intellectual development, and similar to writing, which developed during this period as well. We'll come back to that in a bit. People who've seen cylinder seals only in photos often assume they were large, but they were tiny, just an inch or 2 in height. Each one was a cylindrical bead, usually carved out of a hard stone, with a scene engraved in negative relief. When the seal was rolled on clay, the scene appeared as an endless frieze that could cover as much of a surface as you needed. The image is repeated over and over. The intricate scenes carved on these earliest cylinder seals, they can take your breath away. When you blow up the image to the size of a book page or a computer screen, you can see an amazing amount of detail. One example shows a shepherd, or perhaps a priest, extending his arms toward a flock of 6-horned goats. You can see the plants in the man's hands, the details of his face, his clothes, and his hat. Each of the goats is also carefully depicted. It's astounding that an ancient craftsman working without a microscope could have created this perfect little scene in negative relief on the curved surface of a small hard stone cylinder. In later times, cylinder seals became formulaic, but in the Uruk period, the artists were still experimenting, discovering what could be represented in this new medium. Perhaps the 2 most important developments of the Uruk period were the creation of a form of government capable of administering a state and the invention of writing. Unfortunately, we don't know all that much about the government other than that it existed and that it used the new writing system extensively to keep records. There are no paintings or statues of kings, no secular palaces dominating cities. There are some small sculptures of bearded men wearing belts. They don't seem to be gods. Gods almost always wore horned helmets in Mesopotamian art. They might well be priests, and perhaps they were in charge of Uruk. Powerful men might have been in charge of each of the major cities that were growing during this period. But these men may well have ruled as representatives of the gods rather than as kings. Each city had a particular god that was believed to live there and watch over it. Perhaps the rulers had a close tie to the city god. Writing was a real breakthrough, even though it might not have seemed so initially. The first written signs weren't attempts to represent language. They seem to have been memory aids. Just as a cylinder seal could give evidence of the identity of a man who'd sent off a shipment, a picture of a cow or a bushel of wheat could record what was in that shipment. 2 marks next to a picture of a cow could indicate that 2 cows were sent, and so on. For hundreds of years, from about 3200 BCE onwards, this was the type of writing that was done. There's no way to know what language was being represented. A picture of a cow could be read as the word cow in any language at all. Just think of how useful this was, though. With a way to keep track of numbers and commodities, the administration could record taxes, or tribute to the temples, or rations, anything that was coming in or going out from places of storage. This form of script is known as proto-cuneiform, and it was written down on the same material that had long been used for impressing seals, lumps of clay. The signs were drawn into the clay using a sharp stick or reed. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia were well made, divided neatly into rectangles with straight lines, and filled with the carefully drawn signs that represented numbers and commodities. What could be duller, and yet at the same time more practical? Faced with the impossible task of memorizing mind-numbing sequences of objects and numbers, people invented a tool that eliminated the need for memorization. With writing, they had an easy method with which to recall these things. One problem, though, was that the writing system initially couldn't record the names of people. An ingenious solution was to use the rebus principle, which is an illusional device. Someone's name could be broken up into syllables, with each syllable represented by a picture of the thing that had that name. So, if your name in English was Barbie, you could write the name with a picture of a bar and a picture of a bee. The Sumerian language, which was common in Sumer, the southern part of Mesopotamia, happens to be supremely well suited to writing this way, because almost all the words were 1 syllable in length. The word for arrow, for example, was T. If you had the sound T in your name, you could represent that syllable with a picture of an arrow. The word T also happened to mean life, so you could write the word life with an arrow as well. This principle made it possible to write just about every word in Sumerian. And now, with signs for sounds as well as signs for whole words, the writing system could be used to list commodities and record who sent them, along with what was still owed and who had fulfilled a work obligation, all the details that helped a newly urban society to run smoothly. And that, for ages, was enough for writing to do. Centuries passed before anyone thought of writing for a more literary purpose. Throughout Mesopotamian history, most people never learned how to write. A particular group of professionals, whom we call scribes, mastered the process and were employed in keeping records for the leaders of the community. It must have become clear early on that writing needed to be consistent. Each scribe couldn't invent his own sign for cow, so someone must have chosen among the signs that had been created and streamlined the system, rejecting many signs and bringing uniformity. And over many generations, writing did become consistent. It also became more abstract. Gradually, the early picture signs evolved into simpler signs made up of straight lines with wedges at the ends, which could be written much more quickly. Scribes made the wedge-shaped lines by pressing a reed with a rectangular end into clay at a slight angle. The Latin word for a wedge is cuneus. This is why scholars called the Mesopotamian writing system cuneiform. Any cuneiform sign could be read as a syllable or as representing a whole word, called a logogram, like the ampersand or the @ sign in our own writing system. Early writing didn't have any punctuation, and scribes didn't put spaces between words. Cuneiform was originally written in rectangular boxes, each of which contained a phrase or coherent unit, such as a number and a commodity. This form of writing included hundreds of signs, each of which had several possible values, depending on its context. It was very complicated. Not only did a scribe need to memorize all the signs, he had to know the spellings of words, which were surprisingly consistent, and the correct legal or administrative terms to use. And he needed to be good at mathematics to do the accounting necessary to keep track of palace inventories or taxes, and later for being able to survey fields and determine their area, and to divide up estates. The scribes seem also to have made their own writing materials. Each scribe needed to know where to obtain fine, consistent clay and how to cleanse it so not the smallest impurity would get in the way of the tiny cuneiform signs to be impressed on the tablet surface. He also needed to know how to shape the clay into tablets that would be just the right size for his work, and how to determine the exact moment when it was still soft enough to write on, but not so soft that it would end up covered with his fingerprints. Faced with the need to master this vast amount of knowledge and skill, someone must have thought of creating schools in which scribes would be trained. This was probably initially a type of apprenticeship. Just as boys learned from their fathers or from an expert how to farm or make tools, some boys now learned how to write in cuneiform. Very early on, a shared curriculum with the same texts was used in cities from Syria to the Persian Gulf. Long lists of words were put together, forming the core of what each scribe needed to learn in school. These lexical lists have been found in many archaeological excavations, often with the words in exactly the same order. The lexical lists also provide us with a window into the Mesopotamian conception of knowledge. The words define the world, society, and the universe. They were not organized alphabetically. There was no standard order for cuneiform signs. But some lists were organized based on sound. Words that sounded the same in Sumerian, yet might have had different meanings, were grouped together. Other words that started with signs that looked similar were also grouped together. A third type of list had a conceptual framework, grouping words in categories. One list in this group is almost 10,000 lines long and covered several clay tablets. It focused on terms that would have been used frequently by a scribe during his career. The list included legal and administrative terms, trees, wooden objects, reeds and objects made of reeds, clays and objects made of clay, types of leather and objects made of leather, metals, domestic animals, wild animals, cuts of meat, stones, plants and vegetables, birds and fish, textiles, geographic terms, and food and drink. The words in the list were Sumerian, but the list also gave their translations into another local language, Akkadian. Akkadian was the main language in the area right to the north of Sumer, a region called Akkad. This was near modern Baghdad, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed near one another before separating again. Akkadian is a Semitic language that's related to modern Arabic and Hebrew. Both languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, were spoken in Mesopotamia at least from the very beginnings of writing. It's unclear, however, where these languages originated and how or when the speakers of these languages arrived in the valleys of the Euphrates and Tigris. Archaeologists have found a remarkable thing about this period. The ancient people from around Uruk seem to have set up colonies right across Syria, Iran, and Turkey. There are sites in these distant lands with Uruk-style architecture and pottery, as well as cylinder seals and tools. Unlike the typical interaction in the earlier Ubaid period, when people were merely influenced by one another, the Uruk people seem to have physically moved and settled in the new colonies. On the other hand, they were not building an empire. That didn't happen for centuries. Instead, these early colonies were probably designed to facilitate trade, to get obsidian, copper, lapis lazuli, wood, building stone, and so on, back to the southern Mesopotamian people who really needed it. 3 different types of colonies developed. Some southern Mesopotamians built settlements in unoccupied areas. Others conquered existing settlements, and yet others lived peaceably side by side with locals in the places they moved to. Hamukar, an Ubaid period town in Syria, was one of the places conquered by the Uruk people from the south. Archaeologists have found evidence of buildings that were burned down and walls that toppled. An excavator described the scene vividly. He said, "The attack must have been swift and intense. Buildings collapsed, burning out of control, burying everything in them under vast piles of rubble. The excavator noted that this is the earliest known evidence of organized warfare, and that it helped the Uruk people take over. New buildings were built on top in the Uruk style on top of all that debris. Amazingly, the Uruk people seem even to have been in contact with Egypt, hundreds of miles away. Around this time, Egyptian tombs were built using the Mesopotamian niche and buttress style of architecture. Egyptians also began to use cylinder seals, and Mesopotamian boats appeared in Egyptian art. Egypt was rich in gold, which might have made it an appealing place to Mesopotamian traders. It's unlikely that the Uruk people tried to set up a colony there, but they do seem to have been in contact. Maybe Egyptians even traveled to Mesopotamia. For some reason, this brief flurry of contact ended quickly, and for centuries after the Uruk period, the Egyptians and Mesopotamians appear to have been weirdly unaware of one another's existence. So to sum up, if you had lived in Uruk around 3200 BCE, you might have guessed that you were living in the most advanced civilization that had ever existed up to that point. And you would have been right. Humans were controlling the landscape and the built environment more successfully than ever before. They did so under a new form of state that might have been led by religious rulers, priests perhaps, and which used writing to keep the administration running smoothly.